Similarly, he helped to create and came to symbolize a new political order in which rights and power were based not on the happenstance of heritage, but on the merit and virtue and hard work. He rose up the social ladder from a runaway apprentice to dining with kings in a way that would become quintessentially American. But in doing so, he resolutely resisted, as a matter of principle, sometimes to a fur-capped extreme, taking on elitist pretensions. Franklin's belief that he could best serve God by serving his fellow man may strike some as mundane, but it was in truth a worthy creed that he deeply believed and faithfully followed. He was remarkably versatile in this service. He devised legislators and lightning rods, lotteries and lending libraries. He sought practical ways to make stoves less smoky and commonwealths less corrupt. He organized neighborhood constabularies and international alliances. He combined two types of lenses to create bifocals and two concepts of representation to foster the nation's federal compromise. As his friend, the French statesman Turgot, said in his famous epigram, saying about Franklin, he snatched lightning from the sky and the scepter from tyrants. All of this made him the most accomplished American of his age and the most influential in inventing the type of society America would become. Indeed, the roots of much of what distinguishes the nation can be found in Franklin. Its cracker barrel humor and wisdom, its technological ingenuity, its pluralistic tolerance, its ability to weave together individualism and community cooperation, its philosophical pragmatism, its celebration of meritocratic mobility, the idealistic streak ingrained in its foreign policy, and the Main Street or Market Street virtues that serve as the foundation for its civic values. He was egalitarian in what became the American sense. He approved of individuals making their way to wealth through diligence and talent, but opposed giving special privileges to people based on their birth. His focus tended to be on how ordinary issues affect everyday lives and on how ordinary people could build a better society. But that did not make him an ordinary man, nor did it reflect a shallowness. On the contrary, his vision of how to build a new type of nation was both revolutionary and profound. Although he did not embody each and every transcendent or poetic ideal, he did embody the most practical and useful ones. That was his goal, and a worthy one it was. Through it all, he trusted the hearts and minds of his fellow leather aprons more than he did those of any inbred elite. He saw middle-class virtues as a source of social strength, not as something to be derided. His guiding principle was a dislike of everything that tended to debase the spirit of the common people. Few of his fellow founders felt this comfort with democracy so fully, and none so intuitively. From the age of 21, when he first gathered his junto, he held true to a fundamental ideal with unwavering and at times heroic fortitude, a faith in the wisdom of the common citizen that was manifest in an appreciation for democracy and an opposition to all forms of tyranny. It was a noble ideal, one that was transcendent and poetic in its own way, and it turned out to be, as history proved, a practical and useful one as well. So, that is an excerpt from the book Benjamin Franklin, An American Life by Walter Isaacson. So, that was a little long, but we're going to, as you can tell, we're going to go over Benjamin Franklin and learn about him today. And I can tell you right now, he's one of the more interesting guys I've ever studied. Very nuanced, very unique, and quite possibly just one of the most interesting people to ever live. He might have been like the original Dos Equis guy, and we'll get into why very soon. So you might have heard of Benjamin Franklin. You might have learned about him in school, history class, or whatever. I had at least, and I had a very run-of-the-mill, shallow understanding. He was a founding father. You might have learned that he invented the lightning rod. You might have learned he was a diplomat or whatever it was. But man, did this guy live an insane life. Really incredible. So basically, he was born in Boston, and the book starts going over a little bit of his background and sort of the ethics and values that formed his worldview and his perception of things. So he was born in Boston, which at the time was like very puritanical. Puritans were like a religious sect and known for their dogmatic sort of religiosity, and also for their money. Like and we'll get into this, but they thought making money was a godly thing. So it's just a unique combination of things that led to Benjamin Franklin having such a unique and revolutionary worldview and perception of things. So this is a little excerpt just to describe that. The first couple things we'll go over are more or less just overviews of him as a person and as a life before we get into his actual upbringing. Isaacson says, he was, during his 84-year-long life, America's best scientist, inventor, diplomat, writer, and business strategist. And he was also one of its most practical, though not most profound, political thinkers. And then on the next page, the note I wrote is Renaissance man. Franklin has a particular resonance in 21st century America, a successful publisher and consummate networker with an inventive curiosity. He would have felt right at home in the information revolution, and his unabashed striving to be part of an upwardly mobile meritocracy made him, in social critic David Brooks' phrase, our founding yuppie. We can easily imagine having a beer with him after work, showing him how to use the latest digital device, sharing the business plan for a new venture, and discussing the most recent political scandals or policy ideas. He would laugh at the latest joke about a priest and a rabbi or about a farmer's daughter. We would admire both his earnestness and his self-aware irony, and we would relate to the way he tried to balance, sometimes uneasily, the pursuit of reputation, wealth, earthly virtues, and spiritual values. So those are just some good descriptors of him as a person. He was, we'll get into this, but he was obsessed with the idea of usefulness, like utility to his fellow man, to his community, and that was really what derived a lot of his principles that he lived by. So this is a little bit about his family lineage. The strong yet pragmatic independence of Thomas Franklin, along with his clever ingenuity, seems to have been passed down through 4 generations. The family produced dissenters and nonconformists who were willing to defy authority, although not to the point of becoming zealots. They were clever craftsmen and inventive blacksmiths with a love of learning. Avid readers and writers, they had deep convictions, but knew how to wear them lightly. Sociable by nature, the Franklins tended to become trusted counselors to their neighbors, and they were proud to be a part of the middling class of independent shopkeepers and tradesmen and freeholders. So, as you can tell right there, he comes from a line of dissenters and nonconformists, people who were not afraid to leave the tradition, the ritual, the dogmatism of the society or the group that they're in. They also were middle class, which is hugely foundational to Franklin as a person and to his political ideology that he imparted on America as it became a nation. And really, as I said in the first, or as I read in the first part of this podcast, that middle class, that was not a thing. Like the love, the belief, the faith, and the conviction in the middle class or the common people was not a thing in nations. At this point in history, almost exclusively there was monarchs, kings, elitists, nepotism, meaning people that it wasn't meritocratic. It wasn't based on value provided or deed. It was based on birthright and heredity. So he came from a middle class, and as I said in the beginning, he ended up dining with kings, meaning the king of France in that context. But that's an American thing. And at the time, even more so than it is now, like that was distinctly American, that a man could come from a blacksmith family and end up being one of the most famous people in the world, wealthy, and dining with kings. That was not heard of in any other country. So very important background for him. This is a note about the Puritanic view that he grew up around in Boston. Enterprise was a virtue, and financial success need not preclude spiritual salvation. They preached that being industrious was a heavenly as well as earthly imperative. Making money was a way to glorify God. So, here's another note. Some settled business wherein a Christian should spend most of his time so that he may glorify God by doing good for others and getting of good for himself. So this puritanical belief of making money being a way to glorify and honor God. They were very industrious in their way of life. And that, while Puritanism sort of dissuaded or discouraged Franklin in certain ways, and he definitely parted himself from that belief system, that part did not. Like, he believed in industry, he believed in making money, he believed in economy and building things for yourself and making money. He believed that was of use to your fellow man. But he definitely did part from most puritanical beliefs. As I said, Franklin was the ultimate pragmatic. Like, he did not care for dogma at all in any way, shape, or form. And he actually got accused of being a deist, which is sort of, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but he believed in God, but it was like sort of a distant God. He would cycle through this as well as most people do in life. He had journey, but he believed there was a God, but he kind of believed it was distant, and he believed like one of his guiding principle was doing good by man is divine. Like it is divine to do good to my fellow man. So he was obsessed with utility and usefulness to his fellow man. In that same spirit of puritanical beliefs and industry, here's a little note on industry and frugality. Frugality became for him not only a virtue, but also a pleasure. Industry and frugality, he wrote in describing the theme of Poor Richard's Almanacs, are the means of procuring wealth and thereby securing virtue. So he believed that those industry and frugality were the means of procuring wealth and thereby securing virtue. So wealth and virtue were not exclusive of one another. In fact, he believed they were closely intertwined, which I find to be very interesting. Here's a note on books. So it's a major reason why I started doing these book reviews on the podcast and these studies of people, these biographies particularly, and stories. The common denominator is literally all of these people read. Most of them obsessively, most of them at a young age. They were obsessed with learning. And one thing I think that was interesting about his favorite books, Franklin's favorite books were about voyages, spiritual as well as terrestrial. And the most notable of these was about both. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, the saga of the tenacious quest by a man named Christian to reach the celestial city, which was published in 1678 and quickly became popular among Puritans and other dissenters. A central theme of Bunyan's book and of the passage from Puritanism to Enlightenment and of Franklin's life was contained in its title, Progress, the concept that individuals and humanity in general move forward and improved based on a steady increase of knowledge and the wisdom that comes from conquering adversity. Christian's famous opening phrase sets the tone. As I walked through the wilderness of the world. Even for the faithful, this progress was not solely the handiwork of the Lord, but also the result of human struggle by individuals and communities to triumph over obstacles. Another one of my favorite books was Plutarch's Lives, which is also based on the premise that individual endeavor can change the course of history for the better. Plutarch's heroes, like Bunyan's Christian, are honorable men who believe that their personal strivings are intertwined with the progress of humanity. History is a tale, Franklin came to believe, not of immutable forces, but of human endeavors. So I wrote down romantics, stories about heroes. That's a common thread with many people as well. Teddy Roosevelt being top of mind for me. He was very much so romantic, almost like the most prototypical and archetypical romantic there was. He believed in the ideal and the pursuit of the ideal and the idea of progress, that you can progress in life, that you can work hard and alter the lives of your fellow man and community for the better. He believed in that, and Franklin believed in that wholeheartedly. In fact, it was like one of his most innate and powerful ideas. Like it's one of the things that guided his life more than anything. He ends up running away from Boston when he was like 17 years old, and I'm not going to go into the details, but he ends up, through a bunch of travels, he ends up in Philadelphia, which became his like quote unquote home for the rest of his life, with a lot of travel throughout. He was a prolific traveler. But he basically wants to be an apprentice. He has this whole thing happen with his brother. He runs away, which was not cool back then. It wasn't like just go move to a new town and start over type thing. Nonetheless, he wants to be a printer. He wants to have his own print shop and stuff like that. And he loved writing, as you can imagine. He loved reading. He loved writing. He wanted to be a printer, own his print shop. He loved writing. And one of the ways, since he was a young guy and didn't really have a name for himself, similar to a lot of other people, especially Alexander Hamilton, of being specific, he wrote anonymously throughout his life. And so one of his most famous characters was Silence Dogood, which was actually like an older woman, I believe, an older widow, if I'm not mistaken. So he would write under these pseudonyms, and a lot of times under women pseudonyms, about the things going on in the community, about ideas and things like that. I think there's a powerful idea there, because Alexander Hamilton, for example, wrote a couple like articles or things like that when he was young. And I'll do a podcast on Alexander Hamilton at some point. Some people say he's the most important or one of the most important founders of America, along with Ben Franklin. But he wrote an article or a series of articles anonymously because he was so young at the time. He was living in an island in the Caribbean that got basically that were well received, and people were like, "Who wrote this?" And it actually got him to be. It gave him status and a little bit of a level of importance in society. Same thing with Franklin. He wrote these articles under pseudonyms and things like that that really resonated, and people were like, "Oh, this writer's really good." And it also was good for his paper down the line. But I find that to be interesting. Writing anonymously, it separates the idea from the ideator. It separates the writer from, or the message from the writer, because we often can conflate like because people are fallible, and we know that. So sometimes if we know a person's fallible, we'll just immediately attach that same knowledge to their ideas, even though their ideas might be correct. So writing under a pseudonym sort of separates the message from the messenger. He was obsessed with, like I said, progress. He was literally obsessed, and we'll get into like some of the stuff that he did. But at one point, this note is kind of funny, but he went vegetarian for a little bit because I don't know the exact reason actually. Let me look at this. Here to the book. As a young apprentice, Franklin had read a book extolling vegetarianism. He embraced the diet, but not just for moral and health reasons. His main motive was financial. It enabled him to take the money his brother allotted him for food and save half for books. While his co-workers went off for hearty meals, Franklin ate biscuits and raisins and used the time to study, in which I made the greater progress from the greater clearness of head and quicker apprehension, which usually attend temperance in eating and drinking. So, a little foreshadowing into his temperance virtue. He does like this self-improvement project where he like tries to basically master like 13 or 12 virtues, temperance being one of them. But that's just interesting. That shows how obsessed he was with learning and progress. He literally went vegetarian so he could buy books with the money that he saved, which I find to be fascinating. He also experimented. That's another note. One of the guiding principles in my life thus far is experimenting. You cannot gain wisdom or understanding or perception without data, and you cannot gather data without testing hypothesis and experimenting. So vegetarianism is an example for him. I've never done that. I most likely won't, but it's an example of him experimenting, which was certainly a through line his entire life. He was a prolific inventor, and with that obviously comes extremely... With that comes numerous experiments. That's how you invent. You experiment, you create, you experiment, you create, etc. So he was an avid experimenter in all facets of life. Here's a note that says become mentorable, like become able to be mentored. To the book, he had the happy talent of being at ease in almost any company, from scrappy tradesmen to wealthy merchants, scholars to rogues. His most notable trait was a personal magnetism. He attracted people who wanted to help him. Never shy and always eager to win friends and patrons, he gregariously exploited this charm. It's very, very important. Become mentorable. Become able to be helped. Become the type of person, the type of young man that wants, that older, more seasoned vets want to assist and want to help and want to give a helping hand. That was one of his most defining characteristics, and it's certainly one of the things that got him to where he ended up being. He I'm going to skip over this kind of, but he kind of tossed around the idea of like starting a cult or like a sect of some sort. He was involved in, he loved making like organizations and groups. He ended up starting a I think the first volunteer fireman like organization in America. He started the first library, like rental library. He started a college that is now UPenn, obviously one of the better schools in America and probably the world. He loved creating organizations, and a cult was almost one of them, or something akin to a cult. Didn't end up coming to fruition though. So original self-help is the note here. He was definitely like the original self-help guy. And I'll go to the book for this. Let me therefore make some resolutions in some form of action that henceforth I may live in all respects like a rational creature. There were 4 rules. Number 1, it is necessary for me to be extremely frugal for some time till I have paid what I owe. Number 2, to endeavor to speak truth in every instance, to give nobody expectations that are not likely to be answered, but aim at sincerity in every word and action, the most amiable excellence in a rational being. Number 3, to apply myself industriously to whatever business I take in hand, and not divert my mind from my business by any foolish project of suddenly growing rich. For industry and patience are the surest means of plenty. Number 4, I resolve to speak ill of no man whatever. So, frugality, truthfulness, industriousness, and to speak ill of no man, to not gossip. That kind of reminds me of the 4 Agreements, honestly. Like similar to it. That's a book by Don Miguel Ruiz, which I've read a couple times. Really short, really easy to read. The rules are, the agreements are: be impeccable with your word, which means basically never lie and never speak ill of anybody, never make assumptions, always do your best, and never take anything personally. So similar theme there, but also speaks to the power and ingenuity of his mind. He was like the first self-help guy. He was the first person that thought like actively investing in yourself can elevate your well-being, your status, your monetary wealth, and things of that sort. So, and that those themes still resonate today. Like some of the stuff that he created in the self-help environment is 100% still percolating through society today. Embrace criticism is this note. Franklin ended his apology for printers with a fable about a father and son traveling with a donkey. When the father rode and made his son walk, they were criticized by those they met. Likewise, they were criticized when the son rode and made the father walk, or when they both rode the donkey, or when neither did. So finally, they decided to throw the donkey off a bridge. The moral, according to Franklin, was that it is foolish to try to avoid all criticism. Despite his, quote, despair of pleasing everybody, Franklin concluded, I shall not burn my press or melt my letters. That's just a meta lesson in life. Like, no matter which way the cookie crumbles, you're going to be criticized 100% of the time. There is going to be an angle, a group of people, a person that does not like what you're doing. And as the father and the son with the donkey, it literally does not matter what you're doing. People will criticize. You have to move resolutely forward. There's just no other option. Embrace criticism. Here's a little marriage advice. He had just such a pragmatic way of viewing marriage, which nonetheless, now that I say that, he had a very interesting marriage, and maybe not an enviable one in a lot of ways, but we'll get into that. To the book. When I considered that the character of a good housewife was far preferable to that of being only a pretty gentlewoman, I concluded to send you a spinning wheel. As Poor Richard would soon phrase it in his first almanac, many estates are spent in the getting, since women for tea forsook spinning and knitting. I don't necessarily understand the last line, but the idea is that like it's honestly a biblical principle. There's the idea that like beauty fades, but virtue doesn't. He took that to heart for sure. And not to speak ill of his wife, but I think he even admitted that she wasn't like the most beautiful woman, but she had virtue and was a good housewife. So that's why he chose her. Here's a little poem about that. Not a word of her shape or her face or her eyes, of flames or of darts shall you hear. Though I beauty admire, 'tis virtue I prize, which fades not in 70 years. In peace and in good order my household she guides, right careful to save what I gain. Yet cheerfully spins and smiles on the friends I've the pleasure to entertain. The best have some faults, and so has my Joan, but then they're exceedingly small. And now I'm used to 'em, they're so like my own, I can scarcely feel them at all. So he really prized virtue over beauty, and his wife, I think, knew that. Here's a little bit about his like spiritual. Like I said, he was a deist in a way, sort of like quasi-Christian type deal, but he was obsessed with pragmatism and utility. This is a note on religion. I think vital religion has always suffered when orthodoxy is more regarded than virtue, and the Scripture assures me that at the last day we shall not be examined by what we thought, but by what we did. That we did good to our fellow creatures. Like I said, that is like his guiding principle. Doing well by your fellow creatures is divine. That is the best way to please and honor God. And he believed that. And I think there's some truth to that. It's interesting thing about religion and dogmatism and things like that. there's this idea that I've heard before that that Jesus particularly was anti-religion, which catches some people off guard. But he actually, I believe that he came to persecute the hypocritically religious. He came to save the Gentiles, who were not the religious people of the time. So interesting nonetheless, or interesting for sure. On to the 12 virtues I mentioned recently. He did this like not self-assessment, but the Moral Perfection Project is, I think, what he named it. And there was 12 virtues. I'm going to read the virtues that he tried to master. And what he would do was he tried to master them one at a time, because he understood. He's like, whoa, if I try to master all 12 of these virtues, it's going to be overwhelming. I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm going to try to master one per week and then cycle through them. So here's the virtues and a little description of each. Temperance: eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Silence: speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Number 3, order: let all your things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. Resolution: resolve to perform what you ought. Perform without fail what you resolve. That's great. Number 5, frugality: make no expense but to do good to others or yourself, i.e. waste nothing. Industry: lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. Number 7, sincerity: use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly. And if you speak, speak accordingly. Number 8, justice: wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty. Number 9, moderation: avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. Number 10, cleanliness: tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. Number 11, tranquility: be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents common or unavoidable. Number 12, chastity: rarely use venery but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. So, I mean, those are all phenomenal virtues to aspire to master, no doubt about it. The cleanliness is one is interesting. There's this idea that I think is true, that physical clutter leads to mental clutter, especially for a specific type of temperament. I think I have that temperament, like ADHD, hunter type. If something's out of order, it's very difficult for me to, like, physically, if things are out of order, then I think that sort of results in mental disorder as well. The chastity one is interesting. Like he believed that he was not a guy who would advise casual sex or hookup or masturbation or porn or anything like that. Like he wanted to save his energy for things that were useful, which probably ahead of his time there too. One thing that's interesting, he thought he was a prolific aphorism guy. He created and wrote and probably copied a lot of aphorisms, but these short, easy to remember, easy to understand, easy to deploy in times of need or speech or whatever it may be. These quick quotes, these ideas, also known as aphorisms or maxims. Here are a couple of the ones that he lived by or wrote or maybe even copied, or ones that are attributed to him. He's a fool that makes his doctor his heir, which is funny. Like, don't make the guy that's responsible for your health the heir of your inheritance. Where there's marriage without love, there will be love without marriage. Necessity never made a good bargain. This is interesting. This one right here. There's more old drunkards than old doctors. Think about that. That's like a straight up shot at that don't die guy, Brian Johnson. That's a lesson for sure, because more stress has killed more people than any ailment. Stress is what kills. And so these people, when you get neurotic about health and it becomes the main thing as opposed to living a good life, which is health is a tool to do so, then you get into a bad place. There's this guy, I love mentioning him. I think his name's Herb Kelleher, the founder of Southwest Airlines, if I'm not mistaken. He lived to be like 87, would basically drink every day, would smoke a ton of cigarettes, died with a few $1 billion, built a successful company. There's definitely merit. There's some merit to that. The spirit and the will of living is more important than a lot of ailments. That doesn't mean don't take care of your health, but don't Do your absolute best to not become neurotic about that. Diligence is the mother of good luck. He that pursues two hares at once does not catch one and lets the other go. I've actually heard that said another way. He who chases two rabbits catches none. Search others for their virtues, thyself for thy vices. So that's like the biblical principle of pointing out the speck in another's eye when you have a log in your own. He who multiplies riches multiplies cares. That reminds me of the idea Andrew Carnegie said, millionaires seldom smile. There's definitely luxury becomes necessity. The things that own you become the things that you own end up owning you. That's sort of in the same wheelhouse as that aphorism. He's a fool that cannot conceal his wisdom. That's good. It's a good idea to not make yourself appear or attempt to appear smart and wise and stuff like that. Like it's good to be humble and give advice when it's asked for. Vice knows she's ugly, so puts on her mask. That's a good one. And then one of my favorites, God helps them that help themselves. That reminds me of the Matthew principle, which is to those who have, much will be given. To those who have not, much will be taken away. It's an important lesson. But yeah, it's just cool. He thinks very similarly to me in that way. I love aphorisms and maxims, these quick things that you can deploy, these ideas. Very important. That they're very useful as well. The community was extremely important to him. Like having a good connection and network of human beings. This is also one of the determinants of longevity in life is community and the human connection that you have. And he had a quote, which is really good. He that drinks his cider alone, let him catch his horse alone. So those who enjoy the fruits of their labor alone, let them try to catch their horse alone or their cattle or when their house burns down, try to rebuild their house alone as well. Very, very invested in community and building organization and cooperation in his community. Franklin was able to weave together seamlessly his financial interests with his civic desires and personal enthusiasms. This is a huge principle, and I want to touch on this for a sec. It reminds me of a quote by Sam Zell that goes something like, "Go for freedom. If you go for freedom, you'll do what you love. If you do what you love, you'll get really good at it. If you do what you love, you'll do it for a long time. If you do something for a long time, you'll get really good at it. If you get really good at something, money will come." And I think that the prerequisite for that freedom is experimenting. And as I already mentioned, Franklin was always experimenting with himself, with inventions, with organizations and groups. He was relentlessly experimenting. And that's what allowed him to understand what his financial interests and civic desires and personal enthusiasms were. And then he could create the beautiful conglomeration of all of them. Like he was able to put them all together because he knew what they all were. And I actually tweeted about this recently, the idea that most men don't know what they actually want because they don't experiment. They graduate college, they go pursue money. That just becomes their default want because that's what everybody does. You go get a job for money, you make money. That's just what people do. Then you wake up in 10 years and you have a family and kids. With those come more responsibility. And then you don't have the time, energy, space, or risk tolerance, or even, I don't want to say ability, but you don't have all these things that allow you to experiment because you have all this responsibility and duty. So you don't really actually, a lot of men I think die not knowing what they ever really want. And I don't want to be one of those men. I think experimenting and being able to tolerate the risk and perhaps the lack of financial security that comes with that early on, I'm basically hedging my whole life on that idea. So we'll see if it pays off. I guess it's the thesis that time will tell if it's true or not. But Ben Franklin was certainly aligned with that and was also able to successfully combine those things: financial interests, civic desires, and personal enthusiasms. I pray that you can too. That's definitely a goal of mine. The next note I have is ask. To the book. I did not, however, aim at gaining his favor by paying any servile respect to him, but after some time took this other method. Having heard that he had in his library a certain very scarce and curious book, I wrote a note to him, expressing my desire of perusing that book and requesting he would do me the favor of lending it to me for a few days. He sent it immediately. This is another instance of the truth of an old maxim I had learned, which says, "He that has once done you a kindness will be more obliged more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged. So he asked, and this reminds me of a Steve Jobs quote that goes something like, most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates the people that do things and the people that just dream about them. You have to pick up the phone and ask. That is exactly what Ben Franklin is saying. If you do not ask for what you want, you will not get it. There's no two ways about it. There is obviously a way to do that respectfully and humbly and with genuine interest. And you have to have things that back that up. But he was a believer in asking for what you want. And I think that's a very powerful principle for you and I. Be the person that asks for what they want, not to excess, but with conviction and genuine curiosity. Like for him, he wanted to read this book, so he literally just wrote the guy a note saying, hey, I would really be interested in reading this book. The guy sent it immediately. The worst that they can say is no. The worst they can say is no. You could literally ask for an upgrade on your flight. I've done this before. I literally, on the way back from Nashville, I do it most times I fly just because it's only worked once, but I got a free first class ticket on the flight back from Nashville. I literally just went up to the lady at the front desk and said, hey, what's the chance there's an upgrade available? Gave me a first class flight for free. So that's a small example, but the worst that can happen if you ask somebody for what you want, or if ask for help, is they say no. Bam, end of story, move on to the next. It's not a big deal. We build up this wall or this barrier that's fake. It's just not real. The risk is definitely worth the reward in almost every way. As I said, he invented the lightning rod. He was experimenting all the time. And the reason that's important, that actually got him basically famous all over the world, because houses were made of wood and lightning would strike houses and start fires and actually kill a decent amount of people every year, like a good amount of people. So the invention of a lightning rod, a way to tame lightning, was very important. It was very, very useful for people. And when he was experimenting, he had this rod that would be this metal rod, and he experimented with the tips and the ends. And at one point he had the like a round ball, almost like a ballpoint pen, like a ball on top of this long, skinny piece of metal. And the ball, he found, was not as effective at capturing or attracting the lightning strike as a pointed metal lightning rod. And the idea there, to me, I've tried to suss this out, but the idea that the note I wrote is energy is attracted to points. You can essentially compare a point in this instance to decision, because decision literally means to kill off or to like rid of other options. So energy is attracted to a point. If you make a decision, and this reminds me of a quote that God rewards the specific ask and punishes the vague. Specificity and decision and pointedness and conviction in a particular instance or particular direction is rewarded. That's where energy goes. If your energy is dissipated over a bunch of different directions, then you're not going to get anything. There's not going to be any distance or progress made in any of those directions. Or maybe there will be small in all of these directions. But if you make a decision and you're pointed and you're specific with your ask and your goal, it will be rewarded because energy is attracted to points. He literally proved that from a physics standpoint with the lightning rod. So the lesson there for me is to make decisions and to be specific with my goals and to be specific with my asks. I think that's a really powerful idea. He was very nuanced, and he also used humor a lot. Very, very humorous guy, which I think is why he was able to get along with so many people. There was, like I said earlier, or as Isaacson said earlier, there was like a self-aware irony. He would always make jokes. And in this instance, obviously Indian-American relationships were tense, to say the least. Here's a little note on that. When an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language, and habituated to our customs, yet if he goes to see his relations and make one Indian ramble with him, there is no persuading him ever to return. White people also sometimes feel this preference for the Indians' way of living, Franklin noted. When white children were captured and raised by Indians, then later returned to white society, in a short time they became disgusted with our manner of life and the care and pains that are necessary to support it, and take the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods. So, interjection before we continue on that note. I read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee a couple years ago, one of my favorite books of all time. It's about basically the rise and fall of most of America's great Western American Indian tribes. And one of the things that was noted in that book is that there is, I could be skewing these numbers, but I believe this is what I remember correctly. There was like 0 reported instances of an Indian leaving Indian society willingly to assimilate into American society. There were thousands, if not more, instances of Americans willingly leaving American society to assimilate and become a part of an Indian tribe or an Indian society. As he mentioned, many times when they were kidnapped, when these children were kidnapped and they were brought up in Indian society, if they got the chance to return to American society, they would choose to stay or to go back to the Indians, which I find to be interesting. I think that's a lesson that we should all think on. Why would that be the case? Why would so many people leave our society to go back to what would be perceived as a more savage or primitive way of life and not vice versa? Maybe it's because they lived more fulfilling and aligned and joyful and just genuinely enjoyable lives. I don't know. Something I've thought about, though. Continued on the Indian note. He also told the story of some Massachusetts commissioners who invited the Indians to send a dozen of their youth to study free at Harvard. The Indians replied that they had sent some of their young braves to study there years earlier, but on their return, they were absolutely good for nothing, being neither acquainted with the true methods for killing deer, catching beaver, or surprising an enemy. They offered instead to educate a dozen or so white children in the ways of the Indian and, quote, make men of them. I find that to be interesting. The Indians sent some of their young men to study at Harvard. They came back and they were, quote, good for nothing. So they offered instead to raise some white children and make men of them. Kind of funny. Liberty and safety. Liberty is freedom, the ability to choose. Here's the note to the book. Those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So if you're willing to give up a little bit of liberty to purchase a little temporary safety, you deserve neither. That reminds me of this quote that dangerous freedom is better than peaceful slavery. And the idea that like the path to hell is paved in 1,000 tiny steps. No instance ever that I'm aware of in my studies has a government willingly surrendered or given back to the people freedoms that it has gained from the people. A good example of this is a certain disease that went around a couple years ago. And the freedoms, there's actually a video of Arnold Schwarzenegger during that time saying, quote, screw your freedom, which makes me like disgusted with him because who are you to say screw my freedom? Who are you to say screw your freedom? That's disgusting to me because a government doesn't give back freedom that's been given. It just doesn't happen. An organization wants to hold power. Its aim, any organization, their aim, whether it's spoken or not, is to continually progress its field of domain or the ability to impart regulations or just to make decisions on behalf of whoever the organization serves. That's like an inherent goal of any organization. And so if you're willing to give up a little safety or a little liberty to purchase temporary safety, you deserve both. You deserve neither, rather. I find that to be extremely interesting and very important. This is, given the context of Benjamin Franklin and the American Revolution, that's basically what it was. Like we had a little bit of safety being under Britain's domain, under the servanthood really of the crown of Britain. If you were okay with giving up your liberty for that little bit of safety that came with that servanthood, you deserve neither. And Benjamin Franklin believed that, and I believe that. I think there is obviously responsibility that comes with freedom. It becomes more dangerous because you have to make decisions. You have less order. It's a more chaotic environment, a free environment. But it's up to us at least. At least we have the the liberty to decide, the freedom to decide, the sovereignty that comes with that. And I'm more than willing. Gun control is another example. Like it's just how it is. Like you have to have you have to sacrifice a little bit of safety for a lot of freedom. So Benjamin Franklin believed that. I believe that. I think that's an important note to touch on. Yeah, so I mentioned that he wrote anonymously. Here's a little note on that. It was extremely important at the time, and for him particularly in his rise. Quote, scarce 1 part in 10 of the valuable books which are published are with the author's name. Addison once declared with a bit of exaggeration. At the time, writing anonymously was considered cleverer, less vulgar, and less likely to lead to libel or sedition charges. Gentlemen sometimes thought it was beneath their stature to have their names on pamphlets and press pieces. The practice also assured that dissenting political and religious writings were rebutted on their merits rather than by personal attacks. And that's the same point I made earlier. It separates the messenger from the message. It makes you attack the message and the merits of the message and the value of the message rather than the personal attack of who wrote it. Maybe we should all start an anonymous Twitter account. So in the book now, we're getting into the American Revolution, or the beginnings of it. And at the time, America was a colony, or a series of colonies rather, of Britain. And Ben Franklin has a really appropriate analogy to the power dynamic between America and Britain. To make his point, he published a parable in January 1770 about a young lion cub and a large English dog traveling together on a ship. The dog picked on the lion cub and frequently took its food by force. But the lion grew and eventually became stronger than the dog. One day, in response to all the insults, it smashed the dog with a stunning blow, leaving the dog regretting that he had not rather secured its friendship than provoked its enmity. The parable was humbly inscribed to Lord Hillsborough, which is a guy in Britain at that time. So, obviously, America is the lion cub. Britain is the dog. Britain was treating America as the dog did in that, at the beginning of that parable, treating them, basically just extracting as much value as they possibly could, treating it like it was less than, not understanding or not having the foresight or the vision to see that America was becoming more powerful and would one day grow into a full-grown lion and be able to mangle the dog, which is what happened. That's a very profound vision and foresight that Franklin had. Remember, one of the virtues was silence. One of his virtues was silence. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversations. The note I have here is silence. To the book, silence had often been his best weapon, making him seem wise or benign or serene. On this occasion, it made him look stronger than his powerful adversaries, contemptuous rather than contrite, condescending rather than cowed. So he would use silence as a tool because it made him seem more wise. It made him seem more mysterious. There was like this mystique that came to his almost not lack of acknowledgement, but lack of need or desire to respond to certain things. Like almost like he was above that type of conversation. And there's a particular wisdom that comes, or a perceived wisdom that comes with that sort of detachment from the conversation. That's also something that John D. Rockefeller, who we learned about earlier in 2024, he was very good at that as well. He would make it a habit to not let people know what he think. Interesting. Definitely, I think it's also one of the laws of power from Robert Greene's book. We could all take stock of that. Here I am talking on a podcast and all that. I understand the irony there, but it's a good practice for sure. Rebellion to tyrants is the next note. I think they were creating like the national seal, the American seal, and to the book. Franklin's proposal was to have the motto E pluribus unum on the front and an ornate scene on the reverse of Pharaoh being engulfed by the Red Sea with the phrase, quote, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Jefferson then embraced Franklin's plan, and much of it was adopted by the Congress. I think that's still E pluribus unum, which is out of one many. I believe that's what that means, out of one many. I'm almost positive that's still on the American seal now, which goes to show the reverberating and lasting effects and impact that Franklin had. That was his idea. I also like the idea that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Once again, learning more about the life of Jesus, that's kind of what Jesus came down to earth to do, was to rebel against the tyrants of earth, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. It's one of those examples. A, it's a good lesson, but B, it also just shows the lasting impact of Franklin. Like the reverberating and pervading effects and impacts that Ben Franklin had on America in his time that are still impacting us today. Incredible, absolutely incredible. They're everywhere if you know where to look. It's absolutely incredible the amount of impact this guy had on his country, which ultimately, given America's scale or power on a global scale, the whole world. He's absolutely changed history. So the note is only in America. This is a hugely important thing. I mentioned at the beginning that he was middle class. He would go on to dine with kings. That was an American idea. That was an American thing. That was Ben Franklin's thing. He basically created that thing. That just wasn't something that happened very often, at least. And next podcast is actually going to be on Winston Churchill, who had an American mother, and so he was half American, really, and that's a pervading thing in his life as well. Theme. But to the book. After a mid-afternoon dinner hosted by Vergennes, Franklin had the honor, if not pleasure, of being allowed to stand next to the Queen, the famously haughty Marie Antoinette, as she played at the gambling tables. Alone among the throng at Versailles, she seemed to have little appreciation for the man who, she had been told, had once been a printer's foreman. As she noted dismissively, a man of that background would never have been able to rise so high in Europe. Franklin would have proudly agreed. That was the American dream. That was only in America. That's what made America and still makes America so profound. It's a meritocracy, at least in its most true spirit and essence. It's a meritocracy. A man like Ben Franklin grew up in a poor town as a runaway apprentice, or in a middle-class family as a runaway apprentice, ended up dining with one of the most powerful people in the world and becoming one of the most famous people in the world. He was in France at the time, and that's why he said, alone among the throng of Versailles, she seemed to have little appreciation for the man who was speaking about Ben Franklin. France loved Ben Franklin. They considered him a celebrity. He was very much ingrained in the culture. In fact, he ended up spending, I think, like 10 to 15 years of his life in France, especially at the end, like negotiating the peace treaties and things of that sort with Britain. And honestly, sort of not using France, but leveraging his relationship and his notoriety in France to the benefit of America. What a powerful idea. I love it. I love it. It's not about who you were born into, what family you were born into. It's not about who you knew necessarily when you came into the world. It's about what you did, the merits of that, the value it provided to the people around you. And that's what dictated your rise or your fall, not who you knew. And the Queen of France acknowledged that in Franklin, that was like only an American thing. And as that has become the American dream, he was the one who started that, really. He was like the archetype of that idea. So Ben Franklin was very French in his demeanor, and the note I have here is leisurely. Here to the book. One of Franklin's friends put a more positive spin on his work habits. Quote, he would eat, sleep, work whenever he saw fit, according to his needs, so that there was never a more leisurely man, though he certainly handled a tremendous amount of business. These two descriptions of Franklin's style reveal not just differing views about him, but also differing views about work. Franklin was always industrious, and in America, he famously believed in also giving the appearance of being industrious. But in France, where the appearance of pleasure was more valued, Franklin knew how to adopt the style. As Claude Anne Lopez notes, in colonial America, it was sinful to look idle. In France, it was vulgar to look busy. So he was. There's a couple notes here. Number one, he was adaptable. He was able to adapt to the culture and the society that he was in. In America, he would give the appearance of being industrious. There's this famous story from him when he was a young printer, where he would carry a wheelbarrow of books and printing equipment through the streets, with the noted intention of making people see him and be like, oh, wow, that's an industrious guy. He's working very hard. He would like literally note that. It was like part of his intention of doing that type of thing was to appear industrious. He understood that in America, that was valued. In France, where he spent much of his time later in life, he understood that was actually vulgar, which means like lowly in a way. He understood the vulgarity of busyness and like excessive industry. So he really played into whether or not it was natural or nurtured. Like, he really played into the pleasureful, leisurely side of things. But as his friend said, he certainly handled a tremendous amount of business. Leisure is important. I really believe that. I think we have a crisis of lack of leisure in America. In the West, really, it's hard to completely separate, given the quote connectedness of all this stuff. We have our phones, we have our computers, we have work from home. There's a lot of mixed association with places, things, and tasks. So, for example, if you work at home, that used to be where you came after work, that you could relax, be with your family, enjoy time with your family away from the quote work. Now it's always there. We always have the association with the room, with the place, with the people of doing work there. And there's not as much leisure that's going on. And I think leisure is very important for the cultivation of a healthy spirit and soul, and honestly, the living of a good life. So Ben Franklin certainly mastered that ability. And I think we could learn from that. This just shows how funny he is. He wrote a letter of advice from gout, which is like a disease, I guess. I don't even know what it is, really. I think it's when you eat bad, or you diabetes. I don't know. I know it's not good for you. It's a disease or something that an ailment that you experience. Just an insight into the type of person he was. He was responding to a friend's letter at midnight, and he just wrote this story a conversation between him and gout. Very funny, in my opinion. Also, a really good way to teach lessons. It's one of the things that he did throughout his life. Jesus also did it, spoke in parables, speaking in a way, writing in a way that makes it very understandable to most people. Caesar, I believe, I think it was Caesar, said, if you want your words to last forever or for a long time, avoid complex words like a ship avoids the reef. And I understand very much so, even in this conversation. It's kind of convicting because I know I've used big words. But it's a good lesson to speak simply and to tell stories and parables when you can, and make analogies and metaphors that are easy to understand, because the lessons will land a lot better, a lot more clearer, and a lot more clearly. It's also just an insight to be funny. He loved humor, which I think is so valuable. It makes people resonate with you. It makes you more approachable. Very important. So this is, once again, the negotiations of the war. He's in France. He's the lead diplomat in the negotiations between America and Britain. And the note is proof of work to the book. He even wrote another friendly letter to Adams, whose own commission to negotiate with Britain had been diluted by the addition of the new delegation. Their mutual appointments, Franklin told Adams, were a great honor, but he wryly lamented that they were likely to be criticized for whatever they accomplished. Going back to that donkey story. I have never known a peace made, even the most advantageous, that was not censured as inadequate. He said, blessed are the peacemakers, as I suppose, to be understand in the other world, for in this they are frequently cursed. As a master of the relationship between power and diplomacy, Franklin knew that it would be impossible to win at the negotiating table what was unwinnable on the battlefield. He had been able to negotiate an alliance with France only after America had won the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. He would be able to negotiate a suitable peace with Britain only after America and its French allies won an even more decisive victory. So the note there is proof of work and stockroom versus showroom. He understood that you cannot negotiate a peace at the negotiating table that cannot be won on the battlefield. If you do not have the stock in the stockroom, meaning in the back in the warehouse, that you're trying to give off or show that you have in the showroom, you will lose. It's lying in a sense. It's not a solid foundation. And he understood that on a global scale. He understood that America, if they were not, and the reason this is important, because he was negotiating with France about military support, financial aid for the military in America to be able to buy equipment and manufacture equipment. Because at the end of the negotiation, they're like, okay, well, we should probably just try to go to the peace negotiating table and try to get Britain to negotiate a peace. We shouldn't spend as much money. We might not need to have as much military intervention. Franklin understood that if they could not win the war, the peace would not be favorable to America. So he emphasized and focused on the importance of actually having a strong enough military, a strong enough nation to be able to win on the battlefield what could also be won and hopefully won at the peace negotiating table. Very important. Stockroom versus showroom. You must have proof of work. You must have the engine. It's like if you had a damn an F1 car with a Prius engine. It might look good. it really it might look like it's fast, but when the going gets tough and the rubber hits the road, then like it's not going to do anything. And Franklin understood that when the rubber meets the road, you have to actually be able to perform, and that was instrumental in the favorable terms of the peace that America ultimately negotiated through Ben Franklin. So there's a lot that we're not getting into, and there's only a couple more notes, but Ben Franklin was, throughout his life, very fond of young female companionship. I don't think there's any hard evidence of him cheating on his wife, because as I mentioned, at one point he literally spends like 5 years away from his wife across the ocean. She wouldn't cross the ocean. Then he goes back for like a year or two, and then he goes back to France for 10 years, where his wife ends up actually dying in America before he could return, which is a little bit of an insight into his marriage, I guess, and the type of person he was. But he would always have these female companions. He was very flirtatious. He was a rizzler, as the kids say nowadays. He was always friendly with young females. And I thought this was interesting. One of his French, not mistresses, you could say, one of his French female companions, Madame Brion, wrote him a letter when he was leaving. And I just thought this was really powerful. The farewells at Passy, which is the place in France that he lived, the super nice like mansion that his friend lent him, I guess, or gave him access to on the beach. The farewells at Passy were dramatic and tearful. Quote, "Every day of my life I shall remember that a great man, a sage, has wanted to be my friend," Madame Brion wrote after their final meeting. Quote, "If it ever pleases you to remember the woman who loved you the most, think of me." That's just a well-written letter, and it shows how close they were. He really confided in, he trusted in, he spoke with, he spent a lot of time with these young female companions, some of whom were literally like friends for his whole entire life. They would write letters for literally the entirety of his life, even if they hadn't seen each other in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Interesting to say the least, because there's also, there's a picture actually in this book of, I'm gonna try to find it. You obviously won't be able to see it, but there's context associated. Charles Wilson Peel made this sketch after walking in on Franklin kissing a girl, perhaps Polly Stevenson, on Craven Street, which I believe was in London. So this girl was just sitting on his lap and they were kissing, which I guess that's definitely, I guess that is infidelity, but times were different back then. It was just interesting. He really loved young women, to say the least. Here's a little praise. So here's where we're at in the story. The peace has been negotiated with France, or with Germany through France. America is now its own nation. It's an exciting time. Franklin just did an incredible deed by negotiating this peace. He's going back to America, I guess, to be a delegate or whatever it is, and he's getting praise. So to the book. Franklin could be doddering at times, a bit unfocused in his speeches, and occasionally baffling in a few of his suggestions. Still, the delegates usually respected him and always indulged him. This mix of feelings was tellingly recorded by one member, William Pierce of Georgia. Quote, "Dr. Franklin is well known to be the greatest philosopher of the present age. All the operations of nature he seems to understand. The very heavens obey him, and the clouds yield up their lightning to be imprisoned in his rod. But what claim he has to be a politician, posterity must determine. It is certain that he does not shine much in public council. He is no speaker, nor does he seem to let politics engage his attention. He is, however, a most extraordinary man, and tells a story in a style more engaging than anything I have ever heard." Lesson there, he was not a very good public speaker, and there's several instances of him getting like booed and ridiculed for public speeches and posing like just preposterous ideas to the delegation or the Congress, or in Britain to the Parliament and things of that sort. He wasn't a good public speaker in that sense, but he, as William Pierce said, he told a story in a more engaging way than anything I ever heard. He was able to capture people's attention. He was able to tell stories that had lessons and interested people and engaged people more than just about anybody. And I think that's what made him so likable. It's what allowed him to build so much rapport with so many people. Very fascinating. Humility is the next note. With the wisdom of a patient chess player and the practicality of a scientist, Franklin realized that they had succeeded not because they were self-assured, but because they were willing to concede that they might be fallible. "We are making experiments in politics," he wrote. "We must not expect that a new government may be formed as a game of chess may be played by a skillful hand without a fault." He understood the inevitable fallibility of their plan. He understood that the political game that they were playing was not going to be perfect. Like they were going to make faults, and he was willing to admit that, and that's why he believed that they succeed, not because they were self-assured, but because they understood that they could be fallible. It's that humility that allowed them to come up with good ideas and ultimately create a nation that's done more good for the world than any other nation. So this is the last note. It's Walter Isaacson does a really good job in the epilogue of kind of Ben Franklin was a nuanced character. Like he wasn't just a black and white guy. It wasn't clear, oh, this is like a good guy or this guy was this way. He was so gray and operated in so many middle grounds that there's a lot of conclusions. And as I said in the beginning, how a time perceives or speaks about or reveres or doesn't revere Franklin tells a lot about the time, because he was such a nuanced guy. So here's Isaacson's take on he's speaking about Franklin's son, and the note that I have is good man ? Like Marcus and Musashi ? He had another illegitimate son. He's speaking of Temple, who I believe is his grandson. Yeah, it's William. Temple Franklin is William Franklin's son. William Franklin ended up actually being estranged from Ben Franklin because he was a loyalist during the Revolution. He sided with Britain, and Franklin was like, all right, see ya. Not going to happen. Like, I believe in this cause so much that's going to be really the end of our relationship. Temple, his grandson, spent most of his youth with Franklin in Europe and became very fond of his grandfather. But here, that's the context for this note. Temple had another illegitimate child, a daughter named Ellen, whose mother was the youngest sister of William's new wife, and then he broke bitterly with them all and ran away to Paris, leaving little Ellen Franklin to be raised by William, who was both her uncle and grandfather. For 14 years, Temple neither reestablished contact with his father nor published the papers of his grandfather, even as unauthorized portions of the autobiography appeared in France. The reason I wrote that is because I had a guy on the podcast, a man named Daniele Boielli, historian, podcaster, really interesting guy, very well-versed in history. He posed the question to me that, was Marcus Aurelius a good guy? Because we have, especially young men, we have like a reverence for Marcus Aurelius, that he's this fantastic emperor, this stoic, this great leader. All these positive attributes are associated with him. Daniele Boielli says, okay, if that's the case, if he's such a good guy, if his life was so well lived, then why did his son turn out to be a piece of literal crap? A horrible human being, horrible leader, horrible emperor. And why did he leave the empire that he sought so fervently and dutifully to benefit and to better? Why did he leave it in the hands of Commodus, his son, who was a piece of crap? So his own son turned into a piece of crap, and then because of that, really, his empire, it was really the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. It's just a nuanced thing. Obviously, it's easier in posterity, meaning like once people died and as history goes on, we can view these things with a little bit more nuance and understanding. But if Ben Franklin's son and his son's son and his family sort of ended up being in shambles, is that at the expense? Is that the necessary expense or the cost of doing great things on behalf of a nation? Is that a justification for that? Was it all worth it in his eyes? Did he believe that he did his duty to his nation and was proud of that, even at the expense of his duty to his family? Who knows? I don't know. It's just an interesting conversation to have and an interesting thing to think on. What makes a good man? I was asked this question during my 100th episode Q&A. Who is the most successful man you know, and what makes you successful in his eyes? That's the question that we all have to answer for ourselves. That's the question that we have to ask when we study these people, because all these people have, when you take a microscope to anybody's life, they're fallible, they're imperfect, there's going to be bad things. But it's how do you do the math? Like, what's the equation? What's the formula that we judge these people by? What's the equation that we judge ourselves by? What's the equation that we formulate the vision that we have for ourselves by? How do we dictate or decide what success is? That question can only be answered by you and by me. Everybody's going to have a different answer. What actually constitutes success is going to be different for you and for me, for Ben Franklin, for Marcus Aurelius, for Musashi. But I do think it's interesting to actually think about that. Like, was it a successful life? If his family turned out to be really, really in a lot of disarray and sort of not close, but he helped the nation. Perhaps that's an expense that's justified. But nonetheless, that's it for Ben Franklin. What an interesting life. What an interesting guy. As I said many times, perhaps no other founding father has the influence and the impact that Ben Franklin has on America. Perhaps no founding father had the lasting impact that he had. He was a nuanced guy. He was, as I said in the beginning, I'm actually going to read this again. He was, during his life, America's best scientist. Think about this. At one time, America's best scientist, America's best inventor, America's best diplomat, America's best writer, America's best business strategist. He was also one of its most practical political thinkers. We would be foolish not to study a guy who was the best at all of those things at the same time. He was insanely curious, incredibly, insatiably curious. Like his curiosity could not be satiated. It could not be cured. It was endless. He wanted to learn and know about everything. He wanted to be of ultimate use. I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons, is being useful to your fellow man, being useful to society, being useful to your tribe and your community. The other biggest lesson, I think, is the idea that through focused effort and acquired knowledge and learning, which is really the changing of behaviors. Learning is not being able to recite ideas and quotes. Learning is the ability to change behavior. When you learn something, you change your behavior. He believed that through focused effort and learning, you could progress your status, your monetary wealth, your familial relations, your societal relations, your nation's status on the global scale, your community status on a state scale, your state status on the national scale. He believed that you were able to progress in life if you focused and put in the time, effort, and hard work into doing so. I also believe that. I'm grateful for Walter Isaacson for documenting such a profound life in such a great way. Tons of information. It's a little long. It's like 500 pages. If you want to read the book, there will be a link in the show notes to an Amazon affiliate link. No cost to you. It gives a little kickback to me. Ben Franklin, super interesting guy. Very valuable life. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. Until next time, thanks for tuning in.